Addison Boren, Boren Brick, terracotta, walked to Indiana to avoid the draft, both then returning. John Woody eventually teaching at New Garden Boarding School and surveying the road that is now Guilford College Road, connecting the train station with Old Founders Hall. And with his wife, purchased land that became Woodyside, an African-American community that they bought land for to enable African-Americans to buy plots when they couldn't find other white landowners to sell them. And others stayed here and were conscripted into the Army and force marched with the Confederate Army up to Gettysburg. Like, if any of you remember Seth and Mary Henshaw, Quaker stalwarts here, his grandfather was drafted down in Randolph County into the Confederate Army, refused to carry a weapon, and was forced with the Army to march all the way to Gettysburg. Each day, he was told, you're taking up space, you're eating food, and you're not going to be of any use to us. We may kill you tomorrow. But he was so beloved by the rest of the Army because he would take care of them, he would feed them, and he was a good Quaker that they all said, no, kind of like him, don't kill him. They get to Gettysburg, and of course you know what happened after 3 days of Gettysburg. And so the Army retreats, and here these Quakers have been forced marched or set loose, and they're wandering around the village of Gettysburg, and they're suspected to be Confederate spies or armed, so they're arrested and clapped in jail. And Abraham Lincoln finds out about it and orders their release. They wander out to Indiana to join other Quakers who headed up there. Their young wives, now they were in the early 20s, their young wives back in Randolph County hear about this and get permission from their meeting to load up a wagon with supplies and head to Indiana to find their husbands. Now, these were relatives, his wife and the Henshaw wife and another, who were nursing babies. So they traveled for about 10 miles on what kind of godforsaken roads there were, and build a fire, scare away the wolves, nurse their babies, get on the way, and eventually, through Confederate lines and Union lines, get to Indiana and their husbands, and then they come back to North Carolina. And if you go down to Randolph County, about 7 miles east of Asheboro, you have Henshaw Town Road and Peacehaven Road, the only two roads that intersect at right angles in all of North Carolina. And because they were then to Indiana, they'd seen a grid system and some wonderful old buildings there. They're quite fascinating, including the last remaining old Quaker Academy building, the Evergreen Academy building. But one of my favorite methods of Quakers addressing their conscription into the Confederate Army is those who went bushwhacking and just disappeared into the swamps and into the woods. The first evidence of Quaker cross-dressing was down in Randolph County as this Quaker farmer disappeared into the woods to escape the draft and kept his eye out on his young wife and children struggling to maintain that farm. And in the spring, when they were trying to get the crops in, they would dress in women's clothing and go out and work in the fields, disappear back into the woods. In the fall, when it's time to harvest, put on women's clothing out into the fields. So Guilford College students have nothing on early Quaker cross-dressing. Other questions or comments? I know we're getting close to Quaker midnight here or something. Well, thank you.
You said something about Quakers were illegal or something?
Yeah. When Quakerism began in England in the 1650s, they were nonconformists, and the Church of England didn't take to that very kindly. They wouldn't pay their church tithes. They didn't recognize the efficacy of the ordained clergy. They were known to disrupt priests' messages in the church, but they disagreed with them. George Fox famously, interrupted folk. My favorite was Solomon Eccles, who was one of those Quakers who went naked as a sign. Quakers did some weird things back in the 1650s. No wonder they hanged us in Boston. But anyway, Solomon Eccles would go up into the pulpit. He was a trained cobbler, and start making shoes in the pulpit, saying, you know, this is, you know, might as well be used to make shoes, you know, given what's, you know, preached from here, you know, worth less than shoes. But that did not endear them to the establishment. They wouldn't serve in the militia. For example, in Massachusetts, it was a capital offense to be caught driving while Quaker the third time, because, you know, they wouldn't pay their church tithes, they wouldn't support the church and the clergy, and they wouldn't fight the Indians. So they didn't want a bunch of Quakers in the colony. And so quite famously, 1659, 1660, they started hanging them near Boston Common. We don't carry grudges, but we can still name them. William Robinson, William Levedrant, Marmaduke Stevenson, and Mary Dyer were hanged in Boston for being Quaker. Eventually, there was an act of toleration in 1688-89, and Quakers were allowed to build meeting houses for the first time. So the first meeting houses were actually built to look like barns and houses because they had to blend in because it was illegal to build them. And that's kind of then becomes the architectural pattern for those plain Quaker meeting houses.
Well, have they done anything specific to be hanged? I mean, like.
Yeah, they be Quaker.
But I mean, like a lot of people, even in North Carolina, the first few people that just said, because people who had under 20 slaves were drafted, and they hung them. You know, first people said, well, I just don't want to fight. I don't have any slaves. I don't believe in it. You know.
Well, for Quakers, it was just.
And so they were specifically, but
just because they were Quakers. In fact, you didn't have to prove that they were witches to hang them. It was good enough to be Quaker. Others they had to prove were witches. They assumed that Quakers were bad enough to be hanged even without proving. But that reminds me, also not in the book, but William Penn, our great Quaker proprietor, reputedly was sitting in judgment as proprietor over a case in Pennsylvania in the late 1600s when this old woman, a crone, was brought in to him and said, "This woman is a witch, and you need to deal with her." And William Penn turns to her and says, "Is this true? Are you a witch?" He said, "Yes, I am." "Really? Is it true that you fly around on a broomstick?" "Yes." "We have no law against that." And so she was freed. Yeah.
Was it common that folks who lived in this area took the names from this area and named the communities and so forth?
Oh yeah. If you drive through central Indiana on I-70 or US 40, you'd think you're driving through North Carolina. You start in Richmond, Indiana on the Ohio border, founded in 1806 by 3 Quakers from Back Creek meeting in Randolph County. It's Wayne County. And one of those 3 Quakers was Herbert Hoover's ancestor. And just north of that is Randolph County, one of the 4 counties that voted against the constitutional amendment in Indiana in 1852 to ban blacks from entering the state. Just chock full of Quakers, including Levi Coffin, who, with his wife and members of his family, formed a New Garden meeting in Randolph County, one of 4 New Garden meetings, Ireland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Indiana, as Quakers migrated. And then you go on down I-70, you get to Knightstown, named after Jonathan Knight, the Quaker builder who built US 40, National Road, through the Midwest, and where Hoosiers was filmed. That basketball gym is still there in Knightstown, the old 1985 Peon to Indiana basketball. You go through Greensboro, Rich Square, you eventually get to Plainfield, and then the names, if you look up in the directories, it's Mendenhalls and Henshaws and Unthanks and newbies, tons and tons of newbies up there. You'd think you were back in North Carolina. I do. And some of the names were taken up there by freed blacks who took on the name of their former owners. For example, any of you follow Pittsburgh Steelers football? Remember a running back, Rashad Mendenhall. Rashad Mendenhall is an African American. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't done the research that Gertrude would probably do, but George Mendenhall from down in Jamestown freed a number of blacks when he married a non-Quaker, was kicked out of the Society of Friends, and when she died, he inherited her enslaved persons and set about to free them, educate them, give them the ability to then go to the north and be free. Many of them kidnapped, brought back, and he bought them back and took them back up there and drowned in one of those missions in the deep river. But I'm pretty sure Rashad Mendenhall, who grew up in Illinois, was descended from that group of freed blacks who took on the Mendenhall name. One of my favorite stories about True Bloods, there are True Bloods there too. Many of you may know the great Quaker philosopher and author Elton Trueblood. Elton Trueblood's family came out of Perquimans County. They're in the Great Dismal Swamp where the first Quakers settled because they were escaping the persecution up in New England. So like the Maroons and freed blacks and others escaping slavery, they hung out in the Great Dismal Swamp. No one would get them there. And so the Truebloods came from there and then migrated up to Indiana. And Elton, famous speaker, traveled all over the world speaking. And he had a habit with that unusual last name of Trueblood of looking up in the phone book wherever he was speaking for Truebloods, and he would call them up at random and, just Joshua, this is your long-lost cousin, Elton Trueblood. Well, he was speaking in Perquimans County several decades ago, in the upriver meeting, went to his hotel that evening, looks up in the phone book saying, there's got to be some Truebloods here because this is where we came from, finds a random Trueblood, calls him up, and says, hello, this is your long-lost cousin, Elton Trueblood. It's a long pause at the other end of the line, and the voice comes back, pardon me, but you sound white. There were those Truebloods too. Any other questions? I know we're getting close to